In a desperate effort to secure a victory against the Allies on the crumbling Western Front, in 1944 Germany launched a massive surprise offense through the densely forested and weakly defended Ardennes, in an operation which would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. While initially gaining the upper hand, Germany's momentum would falter, and the snowy forests of Belgium would soon host one of the largest and deadliest battles fought by the United States in the entire war, involving in total over 1 million men, thousands of tanks, and intense aerial combat. Today we're going to break down what exactly drove the German High Command to launch such a risky operation, why it ultimately failed, and how a different outcome in this pivotal battle may have changed the course of history. By mid-1944, things were not looking too hot for the Third Reich. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets were steadily rolling forward, using their superior numbers and tactics to crush Germany in battle after battle, and doing much of the progress Germany had made during Operation Barbarossa and inflicting irreplaceable numbers of casualties. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, the US, UK, and Canada had not only landed successfully at Normandy, but had taken a few weeks to then break through Germany's first line of defense, and by August they were even landing in southern France, liberating territory that had been occupied for more than 4 years. Everything was going downhill, and by this point it was clear, even to Hitler, that war on two fronts wasn't going to be winnable if allowed to continue in this state. If he wanted any chance of victory, he was going to have to make a drastic move, eliminate one half and then concentrate all of his forces on the other. Looking at the current state of the Wehrmacht and his reserve numbers, it seemed there was enough firepower at the moment to launch one more major offensive. When it came to choosing which side to attack, the choice was clear to German High Command. Throwing a desperate last punch at the Soviets would almost certainly be repelled, given the size of their army, and even if the operation were somewhat successful, Stalin had thousands of miles of territory to use for retreating and regrouping. The result would likely be similar to what had happened the first time Germany had attacked in the East, which saw early success but ultimately failed to deliver a killer blow. And that left the Western Front as the best option. If everything went according to the Führer's plan, the offensive would begin as a surprise attack, allowing the Germans to recapture the port of Antwerp and then proceed to encircle and destroy huge swaths of Allied forces in and around the Ardennes forest. In an ideal world, perhaps the Allies would even be forced to evacuate the continent altogether, reliving the horrors of Dunkirk. Just before we continue with today's episode, I do want to take a moment to tell you about the perfect holiday gift, and that is Ridge Wallet. Look, if you're looking for the best gift to give your loved ones, look no further than Ridge. The sleek wallet expands to hold up to 12 cards, plus cash, which clips in there on the back. Plus it's got RFID blocking, so no digital pickpockets can steal your info. Plus, there's the key case, which I have right here. It holds 1 to 6 keys, jingle jangle free. And guess what? You can get 30% off if you buy these two things together. 2 daily essentials in one great deal. And then there's the new Hyperlime collection, which is bright and bold and certainly makes a statement. And for those who prefer things a bit softer, this is the ceramic powder collection, where it's so smooth and pastel, and I think it looks great. I mean, this is maybe not quite my color, but there's a lot of different colors you can choose. That's brilliant. So here's the deal. Shop the holiday sale at ridge.com/warographics and get up to 30% off through December the 20th. Use my link and you'll also get a chance to win a Ridge bundle worth $4,000. No purchase necessary. I've been using Ridge. It's a game changer. 3 million happy customers, 80,000 5-star reviews. Why not? Don't forget to use my link, ridge.com/warographics. And now back to today's video. Throwing such a knockout punch in the West would then allow the Third Reich to move nearly all of its men and equipment eastward and hopefully bring the Soviet march to a halt. And there were a few things that gave Germany some confidence in this outcome. You see, after the initial bloodbaths of landing on the beaches, the Allies actually advanced through France very quickly. In fact, they may have advanced a little too quickly, since now they were not only exhausted from such quick non-stop movement, they were now stretching their supply lines quite thin. These supply issues were a point of major concern for Allied command. Without any deep water ports, they had to rely on airdropping supplies or taking them ashore in smaller craft, which simply wasn't cutting it. The one port that they did capture was Antwerp in September 1944, but it took months to clear all of the naval mines out of the harbour, so it wasn't even operational until late November. And even once supplies had been delivered, moving them around inland was an arduous task, as the French railway systems had been thoroughly decimated by the Allies themselves, battles earlier that year. Germany, on the other hand, had no such issues with their logistics. In fact, as they were pressed back toward their homeland, their supply lines only became shorter and stronger. However, this isn't to say that they didn't have other problems of their own, as Allied air campaigns were absolutely dominating the skies, effectively keeping the Luftwaffe stuck on the ground and unable to gather much information from critical reconnaissance flights. And taking advantage of this air supremacy over much of Europe, the Allies had begun a bombing campaign of Romanian oil fields, worsening Germany's already dire fuel situation. But while weighing out all the pros and cons, there was one detail that tipped the scales: the element of surprise. The Allies expected nothing to come from the Ardennes, as there was a natural defense granted by the terrain, and the German positions beyond it seemed to be minimal. While planning the attack, German High Command kept everything as secretive as possible, even codenaming the offensive Operation Watch on the Rhine, hoping that if any communications were intercepted, despite a strict radio silence regarding the matter, the name alone would convince the Allies that the operation was defensive in nature. The matter was kept under wraps so well that British intelligence didn't even notice it, despite their expert codebreakers. In autumn 1944, plans for the attack were coming together nicely. The goal was to punch through the Ardennes, pave a path to the River Meuse, and make a dash for Antwerp. 3 main advances were planned: a north, a center, and a southern push, all of which would be preceded by shadier tactics like sending English-speaking Germans behind enemy lines dressed as Americans. In total, these 3 initial advances would include more than 400,000 men, more than 500 tanks, as well as thousands of artillery pieces, tank destroyers, and other armored vehicles. It was decided that early December would be the perfect time to attack, since German intelligence believed that the Soviets were planning a renewed winter offensive around that time. They hoped that Stalin would opt to wait for the results of this new offensive before initiating his own, buying Berlin just a little bit more time. Everything was riding on this gamble. The Germans had already crossed the Ardennes and captured Western Europe 4 years earlier, so what was going to stop them from doing it again? On December 16th, 1944, as thick flurries of snow fell across the Ardennes, the assault began with an immense bombardment in the northern section of the front line. 1,600 artillery pieces pummeled an 80-mile front for 90 minutes, clearing the way for the German units to press forward, which included the fearsome 6th Panzer Army. The 6th Panzer was the pride of the offensive, with its leaders such as SS officer Joachim Peiper, handpicked by Hitler himself for the mission. It was given the utmost priority for fuel and ammunition. But this supposedly elite force quickly met resistance from US infantry divisions, especially the US 99th, slowing their advance to a crawl. To make matters worse, a key road that they hoped to use was destroyed, as German engineers had failed to sufficiently repair it in the early hours of the advance. And so, they were forced to take another route, and began heading toward the village Lanzerath. A force of about 500 paratroopers was sent to capture this point, but they were remarkably held off by just 18 men for nearly an entire day. They inflicted about 100 casualties on the attacking force while only losing a single soldier. In the end, they ran out of ammunition and were captured, but they significantly delayed the group's advance, enraging its officers as they were now 16 hours behind schedule. Boiling with frustration, the next captured village saw the Germans execute dozens of US POWs, and then, near the town of Malmedy, around 150 American prisoners were lined up in a field before the SS infantry opened fire on them, killing all but a few who managed to escape. And these would be far from the only war crimes committed during the offensive. In another village just a few miles away, 11 black Americans were captured, tortured, and executed in all manner of gruesome ways. Likely in retaliation to the news of these many killings, American soldiers would later execute nearly 60 surrendering Germans, citing that they had orders to take no prisoners. The next critical objective was the town of Stavlo, which once again proved to be a stubborn thorn. As the German armored column crossed the bridge, the lead vehicle was disabled by a mine, causing a traffic jam, and when the soldiers then attempted to cross on foot, they became easy picking for Allied machine guns. The Germans did eventually capture Stavlo, but at great cost, and after moving on, the town was quickly recaptured behind them. 3 days after the offensive had begun, the advance of Peiper and his elite Panzer Army had effectively stalled. In this sector, the US 99th Infantry Division had been outnumbered 5-1, but despite the odds, they managed to inflict a shocking casualty rate of 18-1. Low on fuel, food, and ammunition, the Germans fought on, but had no chance of reaching their objectives deeper in Belgium. Meanwhile, things were going a bit better for the Germans on the center advance. In fact, it was here that they would make the largest territorial gains of the entire battle. Things were off to a great start for them when a perfectly executed pincer movement surrounded 2 large US regiments, quickly forcing their surrender. The first major objective in the center was the town of St. Vith, where the Americans put up stiff resistance. It took several days for the Germans to capture the town, only being able to do so after first securing its flanks and attacking it from 3 sides. The Americans retreated and the town was captured on the 23rd of December, 6 whole days behind schedule, as this town was expected to fall within the second day of the attack. Beyond this, they continued to move with rapid pace. The 5th Panzer Army, led by the 2nd Panzer Division, was slicing through Allied territory, spearheading a path to cross the River Meuse. But even their success was about to run dry. While the vast majority of this offensive would see German soldiers battling it out against Americans, this lead team in the middle was about to encounter a hastily assembled British force thrown together to protect these vital river crossings. The Germans even made it within sight of the river, so close to achieving their goal that they could almost taste it. But they were then ambushed by the British 29th Armoured Brigade, knocking out 3 Panther tanks and destroying several other vehicles. With this new obstacle, even the centre advance was then forced to slow down, with this narrow spearhead being the furthest Germans would advance in the entire offensive. The push in the south also began with an optimistic advance, as the American lines here were spread quite thinly and were quickly overrun. The scene here quickly became characterized by the determination to capture one vital Belgian city, Bastogne, heavily defended by around 20,000 men. Included in these ranks was the famous 101st Airborne Division, better known as the Screaming Eagles, and they were about to put up a hell of a fight. Outnumbered 5-1, the Americans dug in for a lengthy and bloody siege. Instead of straight up attacking the city with their entire strength, the Germans split their force into 2 pieces, with one to the left to encircle and besiege the city, and the other to continue onward toward the river crossings. One of the key elements of the city's defense was the African-American 969th Artillery Battalion, who often used their artillery as a means of direct fire against enemy armor. Similarly, anti-aircraft guns were also brought to the front to support the rest of their defensive firepower. For a few days, the Germans probed the American lines, unable to make much progress as the defenders shifted their heavy weaponry around to where it was needed most, taking full advantage of their positioning. On December the 22nd, German commander General von Lüttwitz sent a truce party ahead to negotiate a surrender of the town. In a few paragraphs, he outlined the Americans' encircled position, reminded them of the artillery might possessed by the Germans, ready to annihilate Bastogne, and even tried tugging at the heartstrings by ending his message with, "All the serious civilian losses caused by this artillery fire would not correspond with the well-known American humanity." To which the American commander, Anthony McAuliffe, shut down the surrender ultimatum with a single word, responding, "Nuts." This earned him a nickname for the rest of his career. The German truce party didn't exactly understand what he meant, though, and the American negotiators eventually had to interpret it as "go to hell." Despite the big talk of annihilation, the Germans failed to make any significant progress in Bastogne over the next few days, buying enough time for Allied reinforcements to arrive in full strength. Looking at a map of the offensive, the German territorial gains had made a sizable dent in the front line, a salient, or Bulge, in the Ardennes, which is where the name of the battle comes from. However, this is as far as the Germans would get, stopped short of their objective on every front. In fact, it could be said that their most successful attacks didn't even include the main assault. 10 hours after the attack, a V-2 rocket struck the Cinema Rex in Antwerp, killing 567 people, attempting to cause some chaos in the city before the Axis powers could arrive, though, of course, they never did. And far behind Allied lines, the incognito forces, dressed and acting like Americans, had cut significant amounts of barbed wire, turned road signs around, and overall just raised hell far from the main battle. Rumors about these infiltrating spies spread like wildfire, and soon enough the Allies had numerous checkpoints set up to catch these spies, slowing down their movement and response time in the process. A lot of spies were discovered when they didn't know the answers to questions that every American young man at the time ought to know, such as baseball teams or the identity of Mickey Mouse, but there was also a considerable waste of time entertaining real Americans simply because they failed the trivia questions asked them by the interrogators. The funniest of these situations would come when General Omar Bradley was briefly detained because when asked if he knew the capital of the US state of Illinois, he responded Springfield. This is the correct answer, but the MP thought it was the more famous Chicago and mistakenly pinned the officer as a spy for a few hours until the mix-up was realized. Also hampering an Allied response was the failure of its leader to agree on how to respond. Eisenhower believed that a slow advance across a wide front was the best option, while Montgomery believed that a decisive spearhead approach would be best. However, they did eventually agree on a course of action. For starters, the weather began clearing up around December the 23rd, allowing the Allies to finally utilize their air forces. Bombing raids began devastating and disrupting German supply lines behind the front line, and fighters like P-47 Thunderbolts began strafing roads lined with marching German infantry. This also allowed them to deliver much-needed supplies to the besieged soldiers at Bastogne, including a volunteer team of surgeons who flew into the surrounded city in a glider and got to work on the wounded men inside. On Christmas Day, the 2nd Panzer Division, the ones who had punched deep toward the Meuse in the center, now found themselves to be too far from home, and they began to be encircled. They risked being cut off completely. A few breakout attempts allowed some soldiers to escape, but over the next couple of days, huge numbers of their tanks would be destroyed or captured. Then, by the 26th, the Third Army, led by General Patton, had battled through the woods all the way back to Bastogne, ending the siege and initiating a new phase of the battle. By the beginning of January, the Allied ground forces numbered over 700,000, now outnumbering the Germans at around 400,000. The armoured scene had changed as well, with the Allies now fielding 2,400 tanks in the area, while the Germans were down to just a few hundred. There was no way to sugarcoat it for the German High Command. The offensive had been stalled, and the tide in the battle was turning. Despite this, Hitler's delusional mind still believed the plan could be salvaged. Ignoring protests from some of his most trusted advisors, the Fuhrer launched 2 new operations beginning on January the 1st. The first of these was Operation Baseplate, a massive air campaign hoping to destroy Allied air bases and perhaps regain some control over the skies. This was partially successful, in the sense that more than 400 Allied aircraft were destroyed, mostly on the ground, but the cost was immense, as the Luftwaffe rapidly lost 277 of their own planes, many of which were accidentally shot down by German anti-air guns who hadn't been informed of an upcoming air campaign. On the same day, he also authorized the start of Operation Northwind, a renewed ground offensive on a specific part of the front line defended by the weakened US 7th Army. The Americans here fought for a couple of weeks before retreating back a bit, marking another small victory for the Germans that may have looked nice on a map, but certainly wasn't worth the lives that it cost to achieve. While Berlin nervously watched as their grand offensive came to a screeching halt without ever even reaching the River Meuse, the Allied commanders had finally decided on a joint counterattack. Montgomery would lead his British forces southward into the Bulge, while Patton and his army would strike northward from Bastogne. The two would meet in the middle, slicing off much of the salient before pushing the front line back to where it had been in early December. The fighting in this next phase was intense, especially around Bastogne, which saw dozens of destroyed tanks on either side. On the 8th of January, facing staggering casualty statistics, Hitler finally relented and ordered a gradual withdrawal, which saw German units slowly retreat over the course of a few weeks, fighting as they went. The village of St. Vith was finally recaptured on January the 23rd, and by February, all German units had returned to their pre-offensive starting lines. The Allies had successfully pushed back the German offensive, but a new conflict was brewing, this time between the Allied commanders themselves, mostly centered around British General Bernard Montgomery. There is actually a lot of controversy with Montgomery here, as writing to news outlets back home, many interpreted his words as taking nearly full credit for the Allied success in the region, as he largely pushed aside the American forces as disjointed and chaotic until he began to issue orders and save the day. This caused a bit of a rift with the American commanders, who felt he was exaggerating his own participation for fame, because his version of the story was not only far from the truth, but especially since his writings didn't even mention any other American generals besides Eisenhower, and spoke of Americans and Brits fighting side by side. Generals Bradley and Patton both threatened to resign if Montgomery's command wasn't changed, as they felt his stubbornness was only getting in the way of Allied success in these crucial moments. They also felt that the only reason he disagreed with many of the Americans' ideas was because he wanted to be the one to mastermind all the plans and receive all the credit, which is why his desire to make a decisive, rapid spearhead for Berlin would of course include him and his best units leading the way, with everyone else following behind. This distrust threatened to break the cohesion of the Allied forces, something that would have only benefited the Axis. Attempting to undo some of Montgomery's words, Winston Churchill spoke to Parliament and said, "Care must be taken in telling our proud tale, not to claim for the British Army an undue share of what is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war, and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory." Thankfully, the Allies would get over this internal drama fairly quickly and would soon begin recovering from their losses in the battle. Their casualties included 81,000 American and 1,400 British soldiers, 800 tanks had been destroyed, and over 1,000 aircraft had been lost, making it one of the largest and deadliest battles that the Americans would face in the entire war. But for the Germans, this was much more than a big battle with a bunch of casualties and destroyed equipment. The Third Reich was not going to recover from such a loss like the Allies, and they knew it. They'd suffered at least 80,000 casualties, lost hundreds of tanks and more than 800 aircraft. The Luftwaffe was now crippled, especially its fighter branch. In the aftermath of the failed air campaign, one Luftwaffe general lamented, "We sacrificed our last substance." Though they would certainly try, the German Air Force would never again be able to pose a serious threat to Allied air supremacy. Though, at the very least, the damage done to Allied manpower and equipment was seen as a short-term success, having at least delayed the Western Allied invasion of Germany by a couple of months. but it had other consequences. Stalin was elated at news of his allies' success, and after communicating with Churchill, agreed to make his next move, beginning the massive Vistula-Oder offensive a week earlier than expected, an operation which would see the Red Army capture most of modern-day Poland and crossing the eastern border of Germany. Had things gone differently in the Ardennes, the war in Europe may have taken a very different turn. A devastating Allied defeat could have seen the Germans force them out of Europe once again. If this were to happen, the already strained relationship between some of the Allied commanders would have erupted into something much worse, and it could have taken considerable time to make any future offensives in the area. This would have allowed Germany to move its manpower eastward, giving them a better chance against the Soviet onslaught, and perhaps allowing them to retake and hold important locations such as fuel depots in Romania. One can even see a future where they buy themselves enough time and resources to begin fielding substantial numbers of their new jet-powered aircraft, perhaps holding the eastern front line at a distance and preventing the Red Army from reaching Germany in the first place. But none of this happened, and it's very unlikely that it ever would have. Hitler had underestimated the Allied resolve and had paid the price. In the end, the Battle of the Bulge had done little but delay the inevitable crumbling of the Third Reich.